The Praetorian Guard, Chapter 14, The Inevitable. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a soft, golden glow across the kitchen as John sat at the table, his thoughts heavier than he would ever admit. Across from him sat Kara Voss, her eyes meeting his with a calm smile that made him feel more conflicted than ever. It was surreal seeing her here, sitting in his parents' kitchen, as if everything were fine. But everything wasn't fine, not after the mission, not after the cold, calculated decisions he'd had to make. John had been avoiding her for days, running from the tension between them, but now there was no escape. The moment had finally come. The space between them was thick with unspoken words, tension simmering just below the surface. John wasn't sure if it was tension from the mission, the secrets they shared, or something else entirely. Suddenly, Kara's hand slipped across the table. Her fingers brushed his gently, sending a shock through him. He hadn't expected it, and for a moment he just stared at her hand, unsure of what to do. Then, with a soft smile that seemed to ease some of the weight in the room, Kara clasped his hand in hers. "We'll talk later." Her eyes seemed to say, there was no accusation in them, no anger, just understanding. That understanding somehow made John feel even worse. He wasn't used to this, being vulnerable, showing any cracks in the armor he'd built around himself. Kara had always seen him as strong, confident, the one who finished first in the academy and kept everyone safe. Now, sitting here with her, he felt exposed in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. Before John could say anything, his mother, Andrea Stell, bustled back into the room with a tray of fresh coffee. She beamed at the two of them, completely oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. "Ah, it's so nice to have you both here. It feels like old times, doesn't it? Sitting around the table, talking about the academy." Kara chuckled softly, her gaze still on John. "It does feel like old times, Mrs. Stell. John and I had plenty of moments like this, usually involving me pestering him about why he was always top of the class." Andrea poured coffee into their cups, her face glowing with motherly pride. "Oh, Johnny always was a perfectionist, but I'm glad you two are still in touch. I remember when all your friends used to come over during breaks. It was like a second home here." Andrea settled down between them, laughing at old memories and stories from John's academy days. She had always liked Kara, had welcomed her into their home like another daughter. She had watched John and his friends grow from ambitious cadets to full-fledged soldiers, and it gave her endless pride. For the next 20 minutes, they reminisced about old academy pranks and moments of youthful rebellion. The lightness of the conversation offered John a momentary reprieve from the storm brewing inside him. The sound of his mother's laughter, Kara's teasing smiles, it all felt like it had in the beginning. Normal. Safe. But John knew it couldn't last. There were things he had to face, and as much as he wanted to delay it, the inevitable was coming. Andrea finally stood up, glancing at the clock. "Well, I'd love to sit and chat all day, but I've got errands to run. Groceries won't buy themselves." She gave them both a playful wink. "I'll leave you two to catch up. Don't burn the house down while I'm gone." John chuckled, though his laughter felt hollow. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, the house suddenly felt too quiet, too intimate. The small talk had served as a buffer, but now it was just him and Kara, the silence between them echoing louder than before. John swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everything he'd been avoiding pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to speak, to finally address the elephant in the room. "Kara, But Kara held up a hand, her expression calm, her eyes focused intently on him. "John, it's fine. You don't have to explain everything." Her words stopped him in his tracks. John's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? Of course I do. I need to..." Kara leaned back in her chair, her gaze softening. "John, I talked to my uncle," she said quietly. "After everything that happened, I was angry. I felt betrayed. You lied to me, and I didn't understand why." John's heart sank. He had feared this exact reaction, dreaded the hurt he knew he had caused her. The last thing he had ever wanted was to hurt Kara, but the nature of his work, his life in the shadows, had left him no choice. Keeping secrets was part of the job, and he had chosen duty over personal feelings. But that didn't make it any easier. Kara's mind drifted back to the conversation she'd had with her uncle, the Minister of Defense, just days ago. She could still picture the moment with perfect clarity, sitting in his office, her anger spilling out uncontrollably. Memory. Kara sat across from her uncle's large, imposing desk, her hands clenched into tight fists. She had never been so furious in her life.
How could John lie to me? I trusted him with everything, and he didn't even bother to tell me the truth about what he's really doing. What kind of person does that?
Her uncle sat back, listening patiently, his fingers steepled in front of him as he let her vent. But as she continued to rail against John, something in her uncle's expression shifted. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightened, and finally he slammed his fist on the desk with such force that Kara flinched.
Enough!
He roared, his voice reverberating through the room like a shockwave.
Stop with all these complaints, Kara. You're an officer in the Empire's armed forces, and you should know better.
Kara stared at him, stunned into silence.
You've been so wrapped up in your own feelings that you haven't even considered what John has been going through.
Her uncle continued, his voice still hard but more controlled now.
How could he have told you the truth? This is his job, his duty to the Empire. He's chosen his duty over his private feelings because that's what a model soldier does. You should be ashamed of yourself for being so selfish.
Kara's face flushed with embarrassment and guilt. She hadn't thought about it like that, hadn't thought about how hard it must have been for John to lie, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Her anger had blinded her to the truth. Her uncle stood, pacing behind his desk, shaking his head in frustration.
John has sacrificed more than you realize. If you can't see that, then you're not the officer I thought you were.
Back in the present, Kara looked at John, her expression softened by understanding. She knew now what she hadn't seen before. John had been protecting her, not just from the truth, but from the burden of knowing things that could put her in danger.
My uncle helped me understand, John,
she said, her voice gentle.
You didn't lie to me because you wanted to. You were protecting me from something I wasn't ready for. I see that now.
John sat there, stunned. He hadn't expected this. Kara's words were like a balm to the guilt and anxiety he had been carrying. He had dreaded this moment, dreaded the idea that he might lose her forever because of the secrets he had to keep. But instead, Kara was offering him understanding, forgiveness.
We don't need to talk about it anymore,
Kara said softly, her eyes meeting his.
I understand, and I'm not angry.
John felt the tension in his muscles slowly begin to release. His shoulders dropped as the weight he'd been carrying for weeks eased, replaced by a sense of relief he hadn't realized he was longing for.
Kara, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I just thought...
His voice wavered.
I thought it was the only way to keep you safe.
Kara smiled at him, that soft, understanding smile that had always made him feel like everything would be okay.
I know. I get it now.
She stood from the table, and John did the same. For a moment, they just looked at each other, and then, without thinking, John closed the space between them. Before either of them could second-guess it, they were in each other's arms. The embrace felt natural, as though it was something they had both been waiting for, avoiding for far too long. John's hand gently moved to Kara's face, cupping her cheek as he looked into her eyes. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her breath warm against his skin. And then John kissed her. For a brief moment, everything else melted away. The missions, the lies, the secrets. None of it mattered. There was only Kara and the electricity that sparked between them. Kara kissed him back, her hand slipping around his neck as the kiss deepened. It felt like years of suppressed emotions finally breaking free, the tension they had carried for so long releasing in a single, undeniable moment. From there, things escalated. They found themselves in John's bedroom, their connection finally blossoming into something more than friendship. 3 hours later, John and Kara descended the stairs, dressed and composed, but the air between them was undeniably different. There was an ease now, a closeness that hadn't been there before. Whatever had existed between them as friends had grown into something much deeper. As they entered the kitchen, John's mother, Andrea, was already there, sitting at the table with her tea and smiling knowingly at them. Her eyes twinkled with mischief as she looked between the two of them.
"Well,"
Andrea said, raising an eyebrow.
"are the birds loving or reconciled?"
John's face turned a deep shade of crimson he hadn't known was possible, and Kara stifled a laugh, biting her lip.
"Both?"
John muttered awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. Andrea grinned, clearly pleased with herself.
"Good. About time, if you ask me."
Kara, still blushing, gave Andrea a warm smile.
"Thanks, Mrs. Stell."
John and Kara exchanged a look, one filled with unspoken promises, a lingering warmth, and the beginning of something new. Whatever came next, they would face it together. For the first time in a long time, John felt like he wasn't fighting the world alone.